Well, where do you see the leaders then of the future coming from? And what might they be saying to us as we try to grasp this multi-layered thing called Islam?
That's a very difficult question, because it really hinges on what happens in the next couple of years. As I said, you're talking about a population in the greater Middle East that is incredibly young, incredibly sophisticated, technologically savvy, plugged in to the rest of the world, globalized, in ways that would, spin our heads, really. That knows what's going on in the rest of the world, that has internet access, that has satellite, that sees young people in the rest of the world living lives and sort of accomplishing the aspirations that they themselves have, as anybody, at that age would have. And yet, for them, those aspirations are being stymied. They're being stymied first by their own governments, and secondly, they're being stymied by an American foreign policy that has, for 50 years, been predicated on stability over political reform or development. Stability, stability, stability. Why? Because it's much easier for us to control a dictator than it is to control a democratic state.
Or buy one.
Or buy one, yeah. We learned this lesson very quickly at the run-up to the Iraq War, right? All of our Arab allies, and they're all dictators, even the ones that disagreed, with us, pretty much got in line. They either got in line or at least they shut their mouths. The one ally that we really needed, whose help we really needed, was Turkey. Because we needed their airspace. But unfortunately, Turkey's a democracy. So they did what they do in a democracy. They voted. And of course, they voted that they didn't want to have anything to do with this war at all, which was a huge pain in the neck for us. So it's for that reason that we've never really pushed for any kind of political or social development. We're perfectly happy with the status quo, which means dictatorships, stability, etc. Which, by the way, didn't bring us either. It didn't bring us stability. That's not going to cut it anymore. Whatever you want to say about the Bush Revolution, these 8 years have opened up a Pandora's box. We promised the Arab world, we promised them democracy. Now, we in America laughed when we heard Bush say it. When Bush was talking about, we're going to bring democracy to the Arab world, we all snickered. We all thought, this is ridiculous. It's bullshit. This is just this crazy guy, doing his little jabber-jabber. That's not what the Arab world is. On the streets of Palestine, on the streets of Egypt, on the streets of Lebanon, they actually believed it. This is the thing that I think is sort of like, the dirty little secret about this whole, Bush doctrine, is that the Arab street bought it. And when we told the Palestinians that for the first time in your life you are going to get to choose who your political leaders are, and they looked around and they had two choices. They had the status quo, Fatah, which has been responsible for 40 years of suffering, which despite tens of millions of dollars in foreign aid had done nothing but make Yasser Arafat rich, or anybody else. Anyone else. And in this case, anyone else was Hamas. And so when they were given the freedom to choose for the first time in their lives, they chose, anybody else, Hamas. And despite the promise that we made, we shut it down. No more democracy in Palestine. We did the same thing to Egypt. We forced Hosni Mubarak, the man who's been president for 30 years in Egypt, to, for the first time, actually run against someone. So he did. Now that person that he was running against had to campaign from a prison cell. Made it kind of difficult. But nevertheless, He opened it up. He allowed members of the Muslim Brothers to run for parliament. They did. They did enormously well. It scared the pants out of the Bush administration, so they shut it down. No more democracy in Egypt. The same thing happened in Lebanon. And the problem, of course, with this is that it does two things. One, it makes it so that, our word means shit. No matter what we say. And I know I'm going on here, but I want to emphasize this one point about how little our word means now, with something that I'm absolutely certain you didn't hear about. Bush went to Israel, Palestine, a couple of months ago. He stood in Ramallah, and in front of the world's press, he called for an end to settlement activity and the dismantling of all settlements in the occupied territories. He called for Israel to withdraw to the green zone, or to its green line, the 1967 border. And he called for East Jerusalem to become the capital of a new Palestinian state. These were mind-boggling statements to come from an American president. I mean, they were earth-shattering statements. Did you hear about this?
No.
Of course not, because nobody cared. Nobody cared. Here is this miraculous statement by the world's most powerful man, and we have gotten to the point in this world in which his word means so little that people just sort of heard it and kind of moved on. They didn't really do anything.
Where could we access that statement?
It was on A17 of the New York Times.